There seems to be some confusion on what macros are and what VBA is. And macros and VBA is basically the same. A macro is the entire script that is behind the automation of a process in Excel. And VBA is the coding language that is used to create a macro. So basically it's the same. It's not entirely different fields or anything. But usually when people speak of macros, they seem to mean the ones that you record and the ones that doesn't require a lot of VBA knowledge to execute. And then when they talk about VBA, it's more advanced stuff like how you can write the entire thing from scratch. And that's typically a bit more advanced to do so. But basically, VBA and macros, it's the same thing. But what is it? A macro, and which contains VBA code, is a little robot you put into Excel so it does some of the work that you would be doing. So that means that if you're generating reports every day or every week, or formatting sheets differently, cleaning data, all that stuff you can automate with a macro, so that you can just click a button, and instead of doing all these actions that you usually do, you can just click that button and it'll do it for you in a few seconds. So VBA and macros, they are an insanely efficient way of automating your work. I told you about two methods to building macros, to building your first application. And that is either by recording VBA code, or it's by writing VBA code. And I'm gonna show you an example here. Okay, so this is actually an application I built some time ago. It's several years ago for a client. So a client paid me to do this, and then I've anonymized it so you can't really see any details and specifics, but you can see the general structure of it. So this is just the interface. It's not, you can't see everything, but this is the idea of the interface of that application I built. All this you can see is built with formatting, just standard formatting in Excel. So there's no rocket science to any of this. But you see a lot of buttons here, right? So these buttons, they do something. I'm not gonna test it all out here. It doesn't really matter what it does. Just look at the abstract idea I'm trying to convey here. So let's go into this, for example. Add new orders right here. In this little section, you can add new orders. That means you can type in some information here and then click this button to add that information into a database sheet that is somewhere else. Having this layout, this structure, and typing in the information, that has nothing to do with VBA. That's not automation at all. That's just a cool looking user interface, hopefully. But when I click this button and the data is transferred from here into the database, that's VBA doing that. VBA is taking this data and removing it from here and moving it over into the database in the correct place. It's VBA that does that. And also in all the other buttons here, these buttons for navigation, changing views, all that kind of stuff. When I click the button, VBA code runs and do whatever it needs to do to show me the right numbers or go to somewhere else in the application. So basically, VBA and macros is the thing that is holding this system together. It's gluing everything together, because without it, this would just be a simple spreadsheet with a lot of advanced calculations on it. I'll give it that, but it's not really the user interface and the user friendliness and the robustness that you need in bigger Excel applications that automates bigger processes. So you don't need to remember all of this at all. This is just for inspiration that this system, this particular system, would not be possible to create without writing VBA code. And I say write here because this is pretty advanced and you need to write the code for that. You can't record it. All right, so I'm gonna close this down and we're gonna go into recording versus writing. So recording a macro is a recorder that you can start in Excel. So you click that recorder and then it starts, okay? And then everything you do in Excel until you stop the recorder, that'll get recorded, and Excel will translate that recording into VBA code that it'll store somewhere. I'll show you. And then when you need it, you can call on that macro, which is a macro, and the code is executed replicating all the steps that you did when you recorded it. That means that you can record something and then you can play it every time you need it to. So if you record something that takes 3 minutes to execute normally, like apply this formatting, delete this cell, stuff like that, then the next time you need to do the exact same thing, you don't need to spend 3 minutes on it. You only need to click a button or use a shortcut. That's the idea of recording a macro. Now, writing a macro is just opening this page I'll show you in a minute and typing it out. That means you need to remember a lot of maybe not a lot of stuff. That depends on what you need to build, but you need to remember something and maybe look up on Google. You need to learn more. You can't just record everything. But for what I'm going to show you now, you can record it, and let's get to that. Okay, so to record a macro, you need to start the recording. And you do that down here to the left. There's a button called Macro Recorder, but also you can find it up here on the View tab, and you can go to Macros and hit Record Macro. So record a macro here, click that button, and then a dialog box appears, and you need to enter information into that dialog box. And all of this is not really important, so just listen to what I tell you here. Then you need to enter a macro name, and then eventually, or not, optionally, a shortcut. So if you want to play this macro from a shortcut, you need to type a shortcut, obviously, but also you can give the macro a name. The name is not really important now. If you have a lot of macros, that might be important, but for now it's not important. So I'm just going to call this test. And then I'm going to assign a shortcut for this. Let's use Control-Shift-O. All right, that's great. Okay, so after I hit the recording button, I accidentally clicked a few cells. And we'll see later what that means. But for now, I'm not going to do anything. I'm just going to apply the steps that I want to apply and I want to record. So I'm going to go to the Home tab. Moving through the tabs up here, it's not going to be recorded, so that doesn't matter. But when you hit record, you need to be mindful, not like I just did before. You need to be mindful of what you do, because everything you do will be recorded. So here, I want to apply some formatting. Let's go up here and hit this. Yeah, change the cell color into this, and maybe change the font color into this. Let's make it bold too. And yeah, that's about it, I think. I'm going to stop the recording now, and I can click this button right here, or go to the View tab again into Macros and hit Stop Recording. And now the macro is recorded. I'm going to remove this formatting here just so you can see what happens now when I click this cell, for example, and then I execute the macro. So Control-Shift-O, right? That's the shortcut I assigned to this. So when I hit that, the cursor goes to Michael Harris and the formatting is applied. We're done with recording this macro basically. So I executed these steps and now we have the macro recorded, and when I played this, it went straight to B4 and executed these steps that I recorded. The problem with the macro here is that I want to be able to select any cell and then apply the formatting very quickly. But whenever I do that and whenever I use the macro, it goes straight to B4 and applies the formatting there. So that's not really helpful at all. So let's have a look under the hood to see what's really going on here. So I'm going to hit Alt F11 to bring up this little bad boy right here. Okay. So this is the VBA Editor. This is where all the VBA code is stored. So whenever you record something, it goes in here. First of all, the code is stored in what is called a module, and the modules are right here. This is module 1, this is module 2, and module 2 contains the macro that I just recorded. So module number 1 is just a recording I did earlier, and this is the recording I did now. So they're stored in these modules. It's not really more things to say about that for now. So we'll just we'll actually minimize this or maybe close this, I think. and then you'll be able to see this macro that I recorded. These three, I think, simple steps, I changed the cell color, the font color, and the animated bold. Those changes translates into this VBA code. And that basically means that you have a machine that can translate normal actions into code. And that means you have an entire code database at your fingertips, because you can always just record something and then look into the code and see how to actually write the VBA code for it. The problem with recording macros is that it's very inefficient. This seems like a lot of code for a simple action, and that's true actually, because the macro recorder records stuff very inefficiently compared to when you're writing it. So this could be written much easier. But let's just keep it as it is right now, because this is a simple macro that basically takes these actions that I just did and puts them, makes you able to repeat those. But when we look at the code, we see something that is familiar, because I selected the cell B4, the cell number B4, not before. And you can see that right here. You can see something called range B4 select. And that actually means that we select range, which is a range of cells, but it's only one cell, called B4. So B4 is selected. And then with the selection, we're going to do all these kinds of things. The problem is that I select the cell first here in the code. That means it's every time I use the code, it'll be the same cell that gets selected. So actually what I'm going to do here is I'm going to delete this code, and then I'm going to run it. And I can run it up here from the little tiny play button up here. And when I do that, look to the left here, B6 is now formatted differently. Also, if I select this cell and go into the VBA editor again and place this up here, you can see that that cell is formatted as well. That means that I can now select the cell and use the shortcut that I assigned to this, Control-Shift-O, and just format away with all I've got. Okay, so that's how you record a macro and change a little bit about it to make it work. I started recording the macro and then I clicked the cell. I shouldn't have done that. If I didn't do that, if I just had the cell selected from the start and then applied the formatting, then this code wouldn't be here in the first place. And that means that I didn't have to go in and delete it. But anyway, just know that when you have something called selection and you are not selecting anything specifically from the start, the things that happens below this will happen to this selection. We've looked a bit about this. I'm gonna try something else here. Let's go to the new data sheet here. And by the way, it doesn't really matter for you to have all these data sheets. They're not really important. It's not really important what data this is. You can use any spreadsheet for what I'm going to show you here. Here I'm going to insert a new module. Let's just go up here, insert a module, and then I can write code from scratch. So every macro starts with a sub, just the 3 letters sub, and then a macro name. I'm just going to give it a name. Let's give it a name, call it Casper. That's great. And when I hit enter, this line called end sub is automatically inserted here at the bottom. That means that my code needs to go in here between that, and I can just hit enter as many times as I want to get the space that I need to be able to write my code. I'm gonna try something here that is similar to what I just recorded. It's just gonna look more simple because I'm writing it from scratch instead. And this is actually the application that you're learning to build here. It's really simple, and it's not like I can say that, hey, I'm gonna build this application for you and you can just copy the code and use it for anything. That's not how VBA works. This is teaching you some of the foundations of writing your own VBA applications. That means that you can apply the principles here so you can automate your own simple processes with the stuff you'll learn here in this webinar. But this is the macro that I'm writing from scratch. What should we do here? Okay, so I think I want to do the same things that the macro that I recorded did, like almost the same things, just to keep, an easy comparison. I'm gonna write something here. and you're just gonna have to follow along, and we'll see if we can figure out what it means together. So I'm gonna write range here, range C5, interior color equal VB red. Yeah, that's one line. I'm gonna walk you through that in a bit. Range C5 font bold equals true. Okay, so these two lines, they don't seem very complex, do they? Actually, I'm guessing that you can actually figure out what they do. I told you that we have this range C5 that I think it was before earlier in the previous example. Now it's C5, and that means that we're going to do something with the range, which is in this case just one cell, that is C5, and we're going to do something with that. We're going to change the interior color of this cell into red. So range C5 is going to be the font is going to be bold, yes or no, true or false. True. That means it'll probably get bolded, right? If that's even a sentence, a phrase you can use, get bolded. So I'm gonna select the cell here, and we'll see what happens when I play this. Click. Okay. So the thing that happened is that C5 was obviously red, and is obviously red now, and the text is bolded. And the problem with this is actually the problem that we had before, that this is just C5. So if I want to do this again, if I select this cell and I play this again, it's the same cell that keeps on getting bold and red. So that doesn't really help me at all. I need to do the same thing that we saw in the code before. When I deleted this part, like almost this part, it was actually something like this instead. Select. And then with the selection here, then the interior color should be VBA. That is what happened in the macro before. Let's just do that and delete that and see what happens if I select this cell and hit play. Actually, it worked because now the selection, which is C8, that interior color is now VB red. But obviously the font is not bold because that only applies to C5. Basically, we can do the same thing again here. Just write selection, and this actually works. So let's just hit that, and you'll see that this is bold as well. So we can select multiple cells here and play the macro, and all of them will get formatted the way we want it to here. So this actually is pretty logical, huh? But anyways, I'm gonna teach you some theory behind this, and I think actually when I started learning VBA, I don't know if it was one of my colleagues back then, before I started Spreadsheeto, they came and told me about this object-oriented programming, and it seemed like, well, I don't need to learn that. I just learned this. So yeah, I kind of get it, right? Like, you know, something, and we're going to do something with something, right? And we're going to turn it red or bold or something. That's great. But my skills didn't really take off before I learned about these object-oriented programming parameters, which are objects, methods, and properties. Those three things are very important. And I'm going to teach you about them so you don't make the same mistakes that I do. I'm going to teach you about this in a different, with a different example here in the beginning, because it'll help you understand. So this is a car, right? It most certainly is a car. And a car, using object-oriented programming language terminology, a car is an object. And a car, it has some properties and some methods. And the object is just an object, right? It's what you can see and you can feel it. And the properties are properties of that object. That means that a car has a color. That's a property of the car. And the car has an engine size. It also has an engine, but the engine has a size, and that is also a property. So the engine itself inside of the car, that's not a property, that's another object. So a car, it has an engine, that's a, what should we call it, a sub object of the bigger object that is a car. And then that engine, for example, it has some properties. Then there are methods, and methods are what the car does or what is done to the car. So it differentiates from the objects and properties by being something you do. You can put the word to in front of it and you'll see. So to drive or to park, that is something that the car can do, or it could be done to the car. Those are methods. So we have the car, which is an object, and everything in the car is actually an object. But then everything in the car have properties that can be changed, like the window thickness of the windows, the color of the car, you can change that. And there are methods that obviously the car can drive, that's a method, and it can park, that's a method. It can probably also explode, that would also be a method. So let's use Excel terms for this instead. So in Excel there are a lot of objects as well. There are cells, there are ranges, which is, a range is just multiple cells put together. Then there are sheets, which is basically also just a lot of cells put together into a sheet. So cells, ranges, and sheets, and workbooks, which is an Excel file. So the workbook is an object in itself. It contains sheets, ranges, and cells, and a lot of other stuff. But these are the most important ones. Okay, so to wrap this together with the examples I showed you before, the VBA code I wrote before, you have a range. Yeah, so range A1, that's an object, and then this object, the range, it can have a value. And that value is the property. So the range can hold a value, which is a property, and that could be 200. So the range is an object. The value setting equal to 200 is a property that we're changing to 200. We could also change it from 200 to 150, and that would also just be changing the property here. The range, this object here, range A1, can also have methods, which could be to copy, and that's a method. So you can copy the range, and then you're using a method on the object. You are copying the object. So so for us to use this, the selection here, that's the object. The interior is also the object. So this is actually the object, because the interior is an object within the selection. So with the interior of the selection, both objects, we are changing the property color into VB red. And with the selection font, which is also an object within the selection, we are making this bold. And that's how you use object-oriented programming in VBA, thus using objects, methods, and properties. It's really important. This knowledge is really important for you to learn VBA much more easily in the future. So this is a very simple application. It automates 2 actions, and we can play this again if we want, both from here, but we can also make it easier, and let's see, we can make a shape for it. We can insert a button here. I call this button, and I'm gonna pop like that. Yeah, so this is a very small button, and I can right click that and assign a macro to it, and I'll assign the Casper macro to it. And then actually also I'm gonna go into the view tab here and freeze the top row. That means that whenever I scroll down in the sheet, I can still see the button here. That means that I can just scroll down, select a cell, hit the button, select a few more cells, hit the button. Then I can just use this this VBA code that I built into this macro called Casper, and I can just call on that to do what I wrote here. So imagine in a more complex scenario, you wrote maybe 500 things to do, and then you just click a button, and all of those 500 things are executed automatically. All right, so we're going to move on to the next part of this master plan. I'm going to teach you about if statements now. And that is really cool. This was also cool, but if statements, they're really cool. If statements are basically just like the if function in Excel. So if something is true, then this happens. If something is not true, then this other thing happens, right? It's pretty straightforward, but it's really, really cool. It's one of my, it's my favorite function in Excel. That's how much I love it. And that way, with the if function, for example, you can add logic into your code. You can enable Excel to make decisions for you, so you don't have to make decisions all the time. And that's the same you can use here in VBA programming. You can enable the VBA code to make decisions for you, so you don't have to. That's basically what if statements are. So in this case, we have a sub called test and end sub here. So these two lines, they're mandatory. They're always going to be there. This test here, the word test is something you can change for, like Casper, for example. You can call it anything you want almost. So sub test here, this macro has this code in it. And if you put an if statement into this, you're basically like making sure that every line of code is run, and at some point it'll split. It'll split because it needs to make a decision. And it looks at a criteria, just like the if function. It looks at a criteria, and if the criteria is true, then these things over here happen. But if the criteria is not true, if it's false, then these things over here happen. That's basically the if function, but it's called an if statement instead, and it's in VBA. And then after this, the criteria, if true runs, then these lines of code runs, and then if false here to the right, they don't run, or vice versa. But when they're done, they just go back to the normal execution of the code, which is from top to bottom. So the rest of the code will run after the if function, if statement. So in this case, we want to apply these things for certain cells, but not all of the cells. Like right now, it's the cells that we selected. That's great, but okay, let me just, to make this a bit easier, remove the formatting here. Yay. Okay, so I want the macro to apply the red color and the bold formatting here on the bolded font if the cell value is less than 25,000. If it's more than 25,000, I want to color it green instead of red. All right, so let's do that with the if function. You can, and it's much easier than you think. So I'm gonna start with an if. Just write if, then space, then write the criteria, basically like the if function. So write the criteria, and that is if the active cell value, like the active cell is basically another way of saying, oh, selection, except that selection can be multiple cells, active cell cannot. So the active cell is just the cell that is selected. And if multiple cells are selected, it'll be this one that is, you can actually see that up here. That's the active cell B5 in this case, and you can see it is highlighted here as well. So if the active cell value, so this is the object, and this is the property. So if the property, which is value, of the active cell is more than 25,000, more than with this little symbol here, if that's more than 25,000, then something happens. And you need to write that then here in the same sentence, in the same line. And then you hit enter. And then you write what happens if that is actually true. So in this case, I want the selection, or I can just say active cell instead, active cell interior color to be equal to, and that's more than 25,000. That's a good thing. So I want it to be equal to VB green. I want to color that cell green. And also active cell font bold true. I want to make it bold as well. Great. But we are missing the other part of the if statement, and that is that what happens if this is not true? If the cell value is not more than 25,000, then we write an else, just like the if function. So if the criteria is not met, then this happens. What comes next here? Active cell interior color equal to VB red. Then we want it to be colored red. And also we want this to happen as well. So I'm just going to copy that and put it down here. I'm going to delete this because we don't need that. In order to close this up, just like you do with the if function, you write the end parenthesis in order for everything to work. You need to tell the VBA editor here that now this if statement is over. It's over now. And then you just need to write end if, and that's it. Now that way you tell it that there's not going to be more logic here. That's it. I think the most common mistake in doing if statements in VBA is forgetting about the end if. So if you ever have any errors with this, check two things. Check if this is down here, and check if you have forgotten to write end if. So let's just see what happens here when we click this button now. Because I've selected a cell that has a value of 32,000. That means that when I click this button, I'm expecting to make it green and bold. Let's see. Yep, that's it. Cool. Then when I click this cell, I'm expecting it to be red and bold. Yep, that's it. It does. It works. Great. This is the if statement in Excel. In VBA, it's really mighty powerful, and it's just the beginning of introducing logic into your code. It looks very similar to conditional formatting. Basically, it's the same thing, right? So every time Excel, except that conditional formatting is updated whenever a cell value is updated. This only updates when I click the button here.